It won't work.
Okay.
No, definitely can't see it.
Just to review, this is how our course is structured. We're walking rather slowly through the highlights of the history of ideas within Western civilization. So we've spent all our time so far in the ancient world, and we'll be leaving that behind after this seminar. So we studied the Mediterranean philosophers, Socrates and Plato, who was Socrates' friend and follower, Aristotle, who was Plato's follower but disagreed with him. And so now we're moving into, there are a total of 3 authors we're going to consider. Marcus Aurelius is a Stoic, author, thinker. And then Epicurus and Lucretius are Epicureans. But I've just given you teeny tiny little bits of their writing. So this is kind of wrapping up our discussion of the ancient world. Architectural monuments can offer icons of the spirit of the age. So we've been spending our time in ancient Greece. So what is this image, if you can see it from your seat? The Parthenon. What is that? You should know this.
It's a place that they built for the god of Athena.
Good. The goddess Athena, the patroness or patroness of the city of Athens. So it's her temple. It's a Greek structure that idealizes mathematical proportion as a source of beauty. So it's very Greek in the search for beauty and the recognition of the divine. And the search for the divine, like Plato. We're always reaching beyond the physical world to discover what's not physical but what's true. This structure is a Roman aqueduct. With Stoicism, we're shifting into the Roman world. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about the Roman ethos or spirit. And I think the image of an aqueduct embodies that in some ways. We'll talk about that. We'll start with Epicurus. So the term Epicurean is an adjective which describes the worldview of people who agree with Epicurus. We don't know a whole lot about who he was as a person, and we don't know much about his writing. We just have fragments, but we'll talk about who he is. I personally would sum up his philosophy as, don't worry, be happy.
So Bob Marley for the Epicurus.
I think of Jimmy Buffett, wasting away in Margaritaville. You're sitting on the beach, drinking a margarita, just being happy. From an Epicurean point of view, happiness is a string of pleasurable moments. So the purpose of life, to be happy, you do that by just seeking pleasure after pleasure after pleasure. But it's not self-indulgence. Because, as Democritus said, if you overdo it, what's going to happen?
You're going to work it out.
Right. You might have pleasure tonight, but tomorrow you're throwing up, or you're hungover, or you have a headache, or you've destroyed your friendships, whatever. So it's pleasure in moderation. It's really the Epicurean ideal. So Epicurus himself was from Athens, so we're still in the world of ancient Greece. His mother, according to the source I've read, McGee's Story of Philosophy, was a witch doctor or shaman, a kind of spiritual healer or medicine woman. Because of that early experience with his parents, he became disillusioned with religion, disillusioned with superstition, and his attitudes toward the gods or God changed. So he perhaps was influenced by the fact that his mother made a living as a kind of spiritual healer, and he came to despise that. He studied the philosophy of our good friend, Democritus. Democritus inferred that everything is what? Atoms. Right. So he agreed with Democritus. What Epicurus does is he explores more deeply the metaphysical and ethical implications of that view. So if you make that statement, everything is atoms, it's a very small claim in itself. But if you agree with that, then logically there are other things you have to agree with. And what Epicurus and Lucretius did was they explored those implications and created a whole worldview and a whole way of looking at life based on that idea that everything is atoms. So we're going to see that. These are some of the implications that Epicurus and Lucretius both describe. So, if everything is made up of atoms, and this is a syllogism, the soul must be made up of atoms. If the soul is made up of atoms, what happens to it when you die? like smoke or a gas. It just floats away, it dissipates, it disappears. If the soul dissipates physically after you die, then is there an afterlife? Of course not. There's no heaven, there's no hell. How does this contribute to the don't worry, be happy philosophy?
There's no repercussions for what you do in life.
Right. Our life is here. The only repercussions for what I do today are going to be played out tomorrow or maybe next week, not in heaven or not in hell. Lucretius and Democritus in particular, Epicurus, also, he thought that the gods existed, but he didn't think that they interfere with our lives. So he didn't think that the gods punished us for stuff. His concept of the gods is probably close to what we would think of as aliens. They're real beings. They live in outer space, but they don't really have anything to do with us. Maybe they had some sort of role in the natural formation of the cosmos, but they don't affect our lives. So his notion of the gods is kind of demythologized. So the body and soul are made up of atoms which disperse when we die. There's no afterlife. There are gods, but they do not interfere with human life. The goal of Epicureanism, ethically, and we can think of this as a kind of a virtue, a quality that you would have as a person, is atarxia, which literally means unstirred upness. In Greek words, an A at the beginning often means a negative. It's negating something. So atarxia means just not being stirred up or not being stressed out. So one way to translate that would be stress-free. Being stress-free is the virtue, the great virtue of Epicureanism. That's what you want. So Epicurus could be described as a hardcore scientific materialist. But his metaphysics, so that's metaphysics. Everything is atoms is a metaphysical claim. It's hardcore scientific materialism. But it underpins or supports an ethics that sort of decides how are you going to behave if there's no afterlife to worry about. If all that really matters then is the pleasure you feel in the moment, just like Democritus said. So happiness is just really a string of pleasurable moments, and the goal is to seek those. So if what you're seeking is a string of pleasurable moments, overindulgence is not going to do it for you. So it's not a YOLO, you only live once philosophy, as my students were saying several years ago. That phrase is probably no longer trendy. It's not like party today because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. That's not it. You want to live today in such a way that tomorrow will also be pleasant. And the best way to do that is to live a simple life with very few wants. So yeah, you want to enjoy life's pleasures. That's the whole point. Whether you get that from food, from a moderate use of alcohol, from relationships, from friends. So the Epicureans want to surround themselves with friends because having friends is part of being happy. But you do that in a moderate way. So again, I like to just think of the Jimmy Buffett philosophy of you're living on the beach, and I've known students who've done this. They live on the beach and they work at Hooters. And they live a really simple life, but they're happy. So this is the Epicurean notion of happiness. So again, he focused on pleasure, but through moderation. Epicurus and his friends established their own kind of communal little lifestyle outside of Athens called the Garden, where they were able to lead the simple life that they envisioned. And friendships are important in this philosophy. So ultimately, the individual is not alone. You're not really solitary. You need relationships. So just to be aware, you may hear the adjective Epicurean tossed around as synonymous with pleasure-seeking, but it definitely does not mean overindulgence. It does mean pleasure-seeking, but it doesn't mean hedonism or overdoing it. Epicurus himself left few writings that we still have. So the handout that you're going to get is a set of fragments. One text that is intact is his letter to Diognetus, a letter he wrote to some friend of his. But other than that, we have very few writings. So if you take the Epicurean reading, it's going to look easy on the surface. It's going to kind of look like the Mediterranean philosophers, these little maxims. But you do have to think very carefully about what's being said. You'll have to think through very slowly what's the logic, what is the internal logic to what's being said in those little aphorisms or maxims. But you're also going to be reading a little tiny slice from a book, a lengthy poem by Lucretius, a Roman author. So we're seeing Epicureanism move into the Roman world. This lengthy poem is kind of like a summa. Lucretius attempts to use the Epicurean paradigm to explain everything from the creation of the world to the moral life. He has a wonderful chapter on sex. Essentially, Lucretius says, and this isn't in the slide, but it might be worth noting in your notes, human love, erotic love, is nothing but biology. It's just our bodies telling us what to do. So if you're passionately in love with someone and you're dreaming about this lifelong romance, you're lying to yourself. You just want to have sex with that person. That's really all it is. So love is sex in the Epicurean philosophy. Let's not lie to ourselves. Okay? So he's just very practical. I did not give you a bit from that chapter because I wanted to read something different. But if you really like Lucretius and you want to read that, I'd be happy to give it to you. It's hilarious. It's funny if you really read it. I gave you a slice of the reading, and you're going to see where it gets more dense and a little harder to read. It's challenging. On life and mind. So Lucretius writes about what is the mind and how is it connected to the body. In Epicurean philosophy, the mind and the body are not separate things. So what happens to the body affects the mind, and what the mind is doing affects the body. So we sometimes speak about this placebo effect. You give a person a pill, if they think it's real, they'll take it and they'll feel better, even if it's nothing. Or we talk about hypochondriacs, people who think they're sick and they make themselves sick. And we also recognize that when you're hungry or you're tired or you have some sort of chemical imbalance, and that's a physical reality, but it can affect mentally how your mind is functioning. So Lucretius goes into depth, kind of thinking about the links between the mind or the soul and the body, and how can we physically explain those. So it's a very materialistic understanding of the soul. That's the section I gave you from Lucretius. Any questions about Epicureanism so far? Because we're going to shift off of that topic into Stoicism. So now, again, who thinks they're an Epicurean? Nobody know? I hope I didn't completely dissuade the class from this philosophy because it's fascinating. All right, we'll move on to Stoicism and see what maybe you're all Stoics. All right, let's go. Matt, I would have pegged you as one of these. Okay.
On certain things, yes. On certain things, very, very much no.
This is the great thing about this is where the rubber hits the road and you have to choose. You can't have your cake and eat it too on these philosophies. You're lying to yourself if you think you can do that. So you got to kind of choose a side here. And I'm really very interested to see where you guys all come down. Okay. Stoicism flourished, although it began, I think, with an author who was originally Greek. It flourished in the Roman world. So let's talk a little bit about the ancient Romans. You know about them from your previous studies, so I'm not going to beat it to death. But the Romans did three things exceptionally well. They knew how to build stuff. They were practical people. They were concerned about the here and now world and what we got to do in it, getting jobs done. Like, when I think of the Roman ethos, the professor here that I think of is Decima Rossetti. She's like, let's get stuff done. That's just very Roman, very practical, very focused, very task-oriented. This image is a photograph of an aqueduct. A piece of its purpose was to carry water from a distant source in the mountains miles to a city. So it was a piece of plumbing. So when you're driving around Northwest Indiana and you see the roads all torn up, and you see them pulling pipes in, putting pipes out, pulling pipes out, putting pipes in, it's this. It's water infrastructure, essential to a civilization. That thing is over 2,000 years old, and it still works. 2,000 years. We can't even do that. We're tearing up the streets every 10 years around here, right? So their building abilities were phenomenal. So they were very good at building structures. This also, I think this...
Not too many for the Colosseum.
Well, it's still standing. Well, what it was used for perhaps wasn't so good. See? There's a flip side to everything, and maybe we can even link that to Stoicism. There's a downside to Stoicism. So part of the Stoic idea is that we're like stones in a structure. You as an individual really don't matter because you're part of a whole. You're part of something bigger than yourself. just like the stone in the aqueduct. And the aqueduct is strong because the stone knows that. So you're going to find happiness when you realize your place in nature. The Stoics would call this living according to nature. Nature is the whole. We're just a tiny part of it. If you kick and scream and rebel against that, you're going to be unhappy. But if you realize your place in nature and you accept it and you live out that duty, you're going to find happiness. So within Stoicism, there's a tremendous sense of acceptance of the reality around us, and then the necessity for us to find a place within that and to carry out our duty. Duty and responsibility are Stoic virtues. So they built things well. They were also very good at governing. The Romans essentially gave us the concept of the rule of law. Raise your hand if you've ever had to get your driver's license or some type of ID from a Bureau of Motor Vehicles. Everybody, I would hope. Now, imagine you go into the BMV and you sit down with the clerk and they go through all your paperwork. And then the clerk tells you that you got to hand them $50 to get your driver's license. You have to pay a fee. But imagine if the clerk demanded money over the top of that. $20 or $50 or $100, or you don't get your license. Imagine. The reason that doesn't happen in our culture is because we have the rule of law. There are a lot of countries where that type of corruption happens on a daily basis. I'm not going to give you examples because this is going to be on YouTube, but I'll tell you I've seen it personally. We're just going through an airport or trying to get a driver's license or even buy postage stamps. You got to bribe someone. So the Romans gave us the gift of the idea that laws, not people, are supreme. No one is above the law, or should be. No one should be above the law. The law applies to everyone. So they gave us that gift. Governing was their gift. And they were really, in my opinion, the only ancient Western civilization that established a real empire. Alexander the Great, he just ran around with his armies and conquered people. It was the Romans who created a real empire. And it lasted for quite a while. They were also very good at waging war. One of my professors in Chicago told me many years ago, the Romans did not intend to create an empire, they stumbled into it. So they started out with this little city in Italy, Rome, but when people attacked them to take their stuff, like in Republic, they would defeat their enemies, but then push back their frontiers. So you defeat the tribes around you, and then you take their territory. So they slowly expanded up through Europe and into part of Great Britain. The Scottish stopped them. I have to say that. They couldn't beat the Scots. Up into Great Britain, and then sort of east into, I guess what we would call Asia Minor, Turkey, that area, and then even south into North Africa. So they were just incredible at waging war. I vaguely recall reading, and I have to confess I cannot cite the source because I can't find it anymore, that Epictetus' manual, which was the original Stoic text, was used as a training manual for the Roman army. So Stoic philosophy reflected that type of stern discipline. Caesar's armies could march 100 miles in a single day and be ready to fight at the end of it. So stern discipline was very much the mentality of a Stoic. Opposite of the Epicureans, who want to be relaxed and easygoing, right? So you could even compare sports. There are some sports that are very relaxed and easygoing, and there are some sports that are really hardcore disciplines. You can compare the ethos of different sports this way. So, like the Epicureans, ethics was their main focus. In other words, the Stoics were interested in the question, how should we live? Our day-to-day lives. That's what you're going to see. Kind of the beauty of reading Marcus Aurelius, he's going through his day-to-day life, like all the ordinary little things that go on throughout his day, and he's reflecting on them and thinking, how can I deal with these problems? Or how can I enjoy these beauties? He also enjoys the small beauties in a day. So it's a very everyday philosophy. Ethics, how should we live our lives? But again, the ethics was undergirded by a metaphysics. So just as for the Epicureans, the ethics is about pleasure that's undergirded by the metaphysics of everything is atoms. With the Stoics, happiness is really about doing your duty. That's undergirded by a metaphysics, and we'll talk about what that is. Really the idea of the logos or nature. We're a part of something bigger than ourselves, and we're only going to be happy if we realize that and accept it and live in accordance with it.